The silence came before the hunger. That is the thing people forget years later when they tell the story of the winter of 1888. They remember the empty shelves and the frozen passes and the trains that never came. They remember the cold, which was the kind of cold that gets inside a man's chest and stays there like a debt he cannot pay. But they forget the silence that arrived first settling over Millhaven, eastern Washington territory, like a second snowfall, soft and total and final. By the second week of February 1889, the town of Millhaven had learned what it meant to be a place the rest of the world had simply stopped thinking about. The supply train that was scheduled to arrive on the 3rd of December had not arrived. The one scheduled for the 17th had not arrived. The emergency shipment that the territorial governor had promised in January had not arrived either because the Cascade passes were choked with snow, 30 feet deep in places, and the locomotives that were supposed to clear them sat frozen on sidings 100 miles to the west, as useful as the promises of men who had never spent a winter east of the mountains. Millhaven had 260 souls, a general store, with shelves that looked like the inside of an open mouth, and a growing and terrible understanding that the civilization they had trusted to sustain them had turned its back and walked away. But on the hillside east of town, where the morning sun struck first and stayed longest, a woman named Clara Whitmore opened the door of her drying shed and stood for a moment in the doorway, breathing the cold air, letting her eyes adjust to the interior dimness. The shelves that lined the walls from floor to ceiling held what no store in Millhaven could offer. 512 pounds of dried fruit packed in cloth sacks in sealed wooden boxes organized by type and date labeled in her careful hand. Apples sliced thin as playing cards and dried to a supple honey-colored leather. Pears halved and brushed with a light honey wash before drying their sweetness concentrated to an intensity that made the tongue ache pleasantly. Plums transformed into dense, wrinkled prunes that held the memory of August in every fold. Cherries, both sweet and sour, reduced to small, dark jewels that could sustain a grown man through a long day of work on a single handful. Blackberries and huckleberries pressed into dense cakes wrapped in wax cloth, compact and nourishing as anything the frontier had ever produced. 512 pounds. 3 years of rising before dawn. 3 years of climbing through brambles and wading creek bottoms and hauling baskets up a steep hillside on a wooden sledge while a sorrel mare named Ember waited with the patience particular to animals who have learned that their owner always knows what she is doing. 3 years of being called mad. Clara closed the shed door. She pulled her wool shawl tight against the February cold and pressed her forehead for a moment against Ember's warm neck in the small stable attached to the cabin's north wall. The mare chewed her hay with the unhurried contentment of a horse whose mistress had planned ahead. "Well, old girl," Clara said quietly, "I suppose it's time." She had not gone down the hill yet. She would go soon. She was going to go that morning, in fact, loading the sledge with the first 100 pounds and driving Ember down the frozen track into a town that had spent 3 years perfecting the art of laughing at her. But she allowed herself this one moment first, this one moment of stillness, her forehead against warm horsehide, her eyes closed, the cold air filling her lungs. She was thinking about Silas. She would think about that later. She would let herself feel that later. Right now, she needed to load the sledge. She lifted her head, patted Ember's neck once, and went to work. To understand what Clara Whitmore was doing on that hillside, you have to go back 4 years. You have to go back to a spring morning in 1885 on the other side of the Cascades in the logging country of the Willamette Valley, where a man named Edmund Whitmore was working a timber claim when a Douglas fir fell wrong. Edmund had been a careful man. In 15 years of logging, he had developed the particular combination of skill and attention that keeps a man alive in a profession that kills careless men before their 40th birthdays. He read the lean of a tree the way a riverboat pilot reads water instinctively and with his whole body, and he had never lost that reading until the morning of April 14th, 1885, when the fir he had been working twisted on its stump in a way that no one who had watched it grow for 200 years could have predicted and came down across his chest. He lived long enough to say what needed to be said. He asked Clara to forgive the tree. She forgave the tree immediately. The forgiving is the easy part. The logging company sent a foreman named Greer to the cabin 3 days later with an envelope containing $200 and an expression suggesting he hoped very much that Clara would not make trouble. She took the envelope, thanked him for coming, and closed the door. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. She was 44 years old. She had $22 of her own money in the tin box under the floorboard. She had a sorrel mare, a saddle, a collection of tools, and the contents of the cabin, which was not much. She had no children. She had no family within 400 miles. She had no interest whatsoever in the kind of slow diminishment that waited for a woman in her position if she stayed where she was taking in washing or mending or charity until she became one of those thin, quiet women that a frontier town tolerates because it has no other choice. What Clara Whitmore had beyond everything else was knowledge. Her mother, Abigail, had been a fruit farmer's daughter from the hill country of eastern Kentucky, a woman who had brought west with her the preserved wisdom of 3 generations of women who understood that summer is not a promise but a loan, and that the interest on that loan is paid in winter, and that the only way to manage the debt is to work while the sun is high and the fruit is ripe and the days are long enough to dry what you have gathered. Abigail could look at a piece of fruit and tell you its sugar content the way a banker looks at a ledger. She could read the sky for drying weather the way a sailor reads it for storm. She knew the difference between fruit that was dried and fruit that was merely desiccated, between preservation that locked in nourishment and processing that only locked in appearance. She knew the precise temperature at which gentle heat stopped assisting nature and started working against it. She knew these things the way she knew her own name without having to think about them, and she had passed them to Clara the same way, not through formal instruction, but through years of working side by side, daughter, learning from mother the way fruit learns from son, slowly and completely, and without any wasted motion. Clara had been running a serious drying operation since she was 12 years old. She sat at the kitchen table in the Willamette Valley and opened the county map she kept folded inside the Bible on the shelf. She was not in that moment looking for consolation. She was looking for the right piece of ground. She found Millhaven. The town was not remarkable. It had been established in 1871 around a lumber mill that Aldous Pruitt's father had built on a creek with enough fall to drive a wheel year-round. The mill had attracted workers, the workers had attracted a general store, the store had attracted a church and a school and a saloon, and the usual accumulation of buildings that constitute a frontier community's ambition. By 1885, it had 260 residents and considered itself established, which is to say it had developed the particular pride of a place that has survived long enough to forget how precarious its survival has always been. What the map showed Clara, and what no one in Millhaven had thought to notice, was that the valley surrounding the town was thick with fruit. Wild crab apples grew in the clearings left by old timber cuts. Wild plums lined the creek bottoms. Huckleberries carpeted the high meadows above the tree line. Blackberry brambles had colonized every fence line and abandoned homestead for miles in every direction. And the old orchards planted by the valley's first settlers 20 years earlier and left largely untended as those settlers moved on or gave up still produced abundantly each autumn. Apples and pears and cherries fell from those trees every September and lay on the ground until they rotted, because no one in Millhaven had figured out how to turn them into anything worth having before they spoiled. Clara looked at the map for a long time. She saw something that the residents of Millhaven, living inside their routines, had become unable to see. She saw a town drowning in food that it did not know it had. She folded the map, put it back inside the Bible, and began making a list. She arrived in Millhaven in September of 1885 with Ember, a wagon, and $78, which was the remainder of the $200 from the logging company after her traveling expenses. She found a room at the boarding house on First Street run by a widow named Orpha Bellingham, who asked no questions and accepted payment on Sundays, which were the 2 qualities Clara required most in a landlord. She spent the first week walking. Not the town which she had understood within an hour of arrival, but the land around it. She walked the creek bottoms, in the high meadows, in the abandoned homestead trails, in the old orchard rows with the fallen fruit soft beneath her boots. And she counted what she saw with the practiced eye of a woman who had been assessing harvests since childhood. What she saw confirmed everything the map had suggested. The valley surrounding Millhaven was producing conservatively several thousand pounds of harvestable fruit each autumn, and every pound of it was going to waste. On the 8th day, she went to see Elbert Marsh, who owned 5 acres of steep, rocky hillside east of town that he had been trying to sell for 2 years without success. The land was unsuitable for farming. It was too steep for grazing. The soil was thin and stony. There was no good reason to own it, which was why Marsh had priced it at $30 and still had no takers. Clara offered 25. Marsh took it. He signed the deed with the slightly baffled expression of a man who has just sold something he cannot understand why anyone would want, and pocketed the money and walked away, shaking his head in a manner that would within a year become the characteristic gesture of Millhaven's relationship with Clara Whitmore. She paid the remaining difference and had $53 left. The hillside was everything she needed. It faced east, which meant the morning sun struck it early, and the afternoon breeze swept across it, consistently creating the combination of warmth and air movement that is the foundation of good drying. The slope was steep enough to drain well, which meant the ground around the shed would stay dry even in wet weather. The rocky soil, useless for crops, was perfect for a building foundation. She built the drying shed first. This decision, more than anything else she did in those early months, was the one that Millhaven found impossible to understand. A woman alone on a hillside in a new place with $53 to her name and a winter coming, and the first thing she builds is not a house but a shed. Not even a proper shed with solid walls, but a long, narrow structure 24 feet by 10 with slatted walls specifically designed to let the wind through. She built it herself, mostly with occasional help from a taciturn Norwegian named Ulfson, who did carpentry work around the valley and asked no questions about her intentions. The structure had a cedar shake roof to keep the rain off slatted walls of overlapping boards set at angles to maximize airflow, while blocking direct rain, and interior racks at 3 levels fitted with frames of cheesecloth stretched taut over pine borders. The frames slid in and out like drawers. A small stone hearth at one end provided supplemental heat for the wet autumn days when sun and wind alone were insufficient. She had learned from Abigail that the great enemies of proper drying were not insufficient heat, but excessive heat and insufficient airflow. Too much heat cooks the fruit rather than drying it, changing the cellular structure in ways that destroy the very nutrients that make preserved fruit worth eating. The goal is not to apply heat, but to remove moisture, and the most reliable tool for removing moisture is moving air. Heat assists air. Air does the work. The shed was designed around this principle. When it was done, she built the cabin. It was modest, one room, a sleeping loft, a fieldstone hearth, a covered porch. Ember had a lean-to stable attached to the north wall, tight and dry. The total cost of land, shed, and cabin came to $61. She had enough left for initial supplies and seed. She began harvesting that same autumn of 1885, working from the first gray light until the dark made it impossible. She gathered wild plums from the creek bottoms, filling baskets that Ember hauled up the hillside on the wooden sledge. She picked huckleberries on the high meadows until her hands were stained so deeply purple that Mrs. Bellingham, when Clara stopped in to settle her final week's board, looked at those hands with an expression of profound disapproval and said nothing, which was Clara had learned Mrs. Bellingham's most eloquent form of communication. She collected fallen apples from the abandoned orchards, sorting them on the hillside, cutting away the bruised and wormy portions, carrying the good fruit up to the shed in loads that left her shoulders aching by evening. She worked with the deliberate efficiency of a woman who has calculated exactly how much time she has and exactly how much she needs to accomplish in that time, and who has found the calculations satisfying rather than alarming. The drying itself required the accumulated knowledge of 3 generations. Apples were cored, peeled, sliced to a 1/4-inch thickness, and dipped briefly in salted water to prevent browning before being laid on the cheesecloth frames. The salt bath was a trick of Abigail's mother, old grandmother Rourke, who had brought it from Kentucky and refused to explain its chemistry but insisted on its necessity. Clara had tested it both ways once in her 20s and found that Grandmother Rourke had been entirely correct, as grandmothers who have spent 60 years perfecting a technique generally are. Pears were halved, their cores scooped out, brushed with a thin honey wash before drying. The honey enhanced their natural sweetness and gave the finished product a golden translucence that made them look almost too beautiful to eat. Almost. Plums were halved and pitted, laid, cut side up on the frames to let the moisture escape gradually rather than being trapped by a sealed surface. The first batch Clara had ever dried at age 11 under Abigail's instruction had been laid, cut side down, and the result had been plums that were dried on the outside and fermented in the middle, which Abigail had presented to Clara, not as a failure but as information. "You know now," she said, That is worth more than a batch of good plums. Cherries, both sweet and sour, were left whole stems removed, dried slowly at the lowest possible temperature over the longest possible time. The slow drying preserved their shape and concentrated their flavor without making them brittle. Done right, a dried cherry held between two fingers should bend rather than crack, and when you bit into it, the flavor should arrive in stages, first sweet, then complex, then a finish that lingered. Clara had 40 pounds of dried apple rings ready by late October of 1885. She brought a sample to Millhaven. Harlan Cobb had been the commercial heart of Millhaven for 11 years. He was a compact, deliberate man of 52, with ginger-colored side whiskers going to gray, and the kind of eyes that calculated prices, the way other men's eyes calculate distances automatically and without apparent effort. He had come to Millhaven in 1874 with experience in general merchandise and a clear-eyed understanding of what a frontier town required from a merchant: complete stock, reliable supply, and the confidence of its customers, which last was best maintained by being the only merchant in town. He had achieved all three. His store on Main Street carried everything that 260 people could need, from flour and coffee and salt pork to nails and fabric and patent medicine, in the particular brand of thread that Mrs. Aldous Pruitt required for her needlework, which Cobb stocked in 3 colors because Mrs. Pruitt's goodwill was worth more to a merchant than any thread was worth to a seamstress. His supply came from a company in Portland, Hargrove and Sons, with which he had a contract that had been mutually satisfying for 9 years. The contract specified terms, prices, and most importantly, exclusivity. Cobb agreed to source all his inventory through Hargrove and Sons. Hargrove and Sons agreed to give Cobb a discount that made his prices competitive and his margins comfortable. The arrangement worked well for both parties and was the foundation on which Cobb had built everything he owned. He was behind his counter when Clara came in that October morning, and he examined her dried apple rings with the theatrical deliberateness of a man performing an assessment for an audience, though the store was nearly empty. He held one up to the light from the window. He bent it between his fingers. He smelled it. He turned it over. He set it on the counter and looked at it. Then he picked it up again and bit off a small piece and chewed it slowly. What happened in Harlan Cobb's face in the next several seconds was interesting, and Clara, who was watching carefully, noted it with the attention she gave to all significant information. His expression shifted from theatrical skepticism through something that might have been surprise and arrived somewhere that was almost certainly recognition. He recognized quality. He knew what he was tasting. He set the rest of the apple ring down on the counter. "Dried fruit," he said flatly. "You want me to carry dried fruit?" "I was hoping to set up a table outside on market days," Clara said, "to sell it myself. I'm not asking you to carry it." Cobb's eyes moved from the apple ring to Clara and back to the apple ring. "Mrs. Drummond." "Whitmore," Clara said. "My name is Whitmore." "Mrs. Whitmore." He said the name with the faint emphasis of a man correcting a filing error. "I stock everything this town needs, including dried fruit, when the supplies train brings it from Portland. Proper dried fruit from proper operations. What you have here is," he made a gesture that managed to dismiss both the apple ring and the effort that had produced it, "homemade. People want what they know." "This is better than what they know," Clara said without heat. She said it the way she might state a drying time or a temperature, as information. Cobb's eyes did something brief and complicated. "The answer is no, Mrs. Whitmore. You may not set up outside my store." Clara looked at him for a moment. There was no anger in her face. There was something more patient than anger, and in some ways more difficult to meet. "All right," she said. She gathered her samples and left. What she did not know and would not know for 3 years was what Harlan Cobb did after she walked out. He stood behind his counter for a long moment. Then he picked up the rest of the apple ring she had left on the counter and ate it. He ate it slowly, the way he had bitten off the first piece, and his face was very still while he did it. Then he went to the back room where he kept his correspondence and wrote his quarterly order to Hargrove and Sons. And he did not include dried fruit in the order, not because he did not know the value of what Clara had brought him, but because the contract with Hargrove and Sons specified that he would source his inventory through them, and dried fruit from a local producer was not something Hargrove and Sons supplied, and Cobb was not a man who complicated arrangements that worked. He chose the contract. He knew what he was choosing. He made the choice deliberately and recorded it in no document and mentioned it to no one, and he did not think about it again for a long time. The mockery began that winter. It started with Aldous Pruitt, which was where most things in Millhaven started. Pruitt owned the sawmill that his father had built, and by extension, the employment of a significant portion of the town's working men, and by further extension, the particular authority that comes to a man when other men depend on him for their wages. He was 55 years old, broad through the chest, with a gray beard kept neatly trimmed, and the loud, comfortable laugh of a man who has never had to wonder whether the room would laugh with him. He heard about the widow on the hill and her fruit drying operation from 3 different people in the same week, which told him it was worth noticing. He rode up the hillside one afternoon in November with 2 of his foremen and looked at the shed from horseback, and then he laughed his large, comfortable laugh and said loud enough to carry, "Boys, I believe we've found ourselves a genuine madhouse." The name settled onto the shed immediately, the way names do when they are spoken by the right person at the right moment. The widow's madhouse. It was said at first with amusement, then with the comfortable contempt that amusement calcifies into when it goes unchallenged. Pruitt's wife, Constance, organized a meeting of the Women's Auxiliary at the First Methodist Church to discuss the matter. The meeting was not officially about Clara Whitmore. It was officially about charitable outreach to newcomers in the valley. But everyone who attended knew what it was really about, because that is how social mechanics work in small places, and the women of Millhaven were no less sophisticated than women anywhere else, which is to say they were entirely sophisticated. The meeting concluded that Clara Whitmore's operation was eccentric, possibly unwholesome, and certainly the product of a grief that had not been properly channeled. The open-sided shed was declared unsanitary due to exposure to birds and insects. The industrial quantity of dried fruit, by then nearly 200 pounds with the second season barely underway, was described as evidence of a fixation rather than a vocation. The consensus was that the poor creature meant well and should be treated with the compassionate distance appropriate to those who have been affected by loss. There was one dissenting voice. A young woman named Vera Houghton, 26 years old, whose husband worked at Pruitt's mill, raised her hand at the Women's Auxiliary meeting and said that she had spoken with Mrs. Whitmore briefly in town, and that Mrs. Whitmore had offered to teach her to dry fruit, and that she thought she might like to learn. The room's response was not hostile. It was something more effective than hostile. It was patient. Constance Pruitt smiled the gentle, careful smile of a woman exercising authority. She does not need to raise her voice to demonstrate, and explained that it would not do for the wife of a Pruitt Mill employee to associate herself with an enterprise that the community had concerns about. It would reflect on her husband, and by extension on Mr. Pruitt, and that would be unfortunate. Vera Houghton withdrew her hand. She did not say anything more. She went home that afternoon and began the winter like every other winter, buying her supplies from Cobb's store and trusting the supply train to keep bringing more. She did not think about what she might have learned. Not yet. There was one person in Millhaven who did not participate in the mockery. Old Silas Holt was 68 years old, a retired logger who had come to the valley in the early days of the mill and stayed because staying required less effort than leaving, and because the valley was beautiful in a way that had crept up on him slowly over 20 years until it had become something he could not imagine living without. He lived alone in a small cabin on the south edge of town, kept a cord of wood stacked to the eaves each winter, and conducted himself according to a personal code that was not verbose on any subject. He passed Clara on the road to town one morning in October of 1885, the first week she was working the hillside, and tipped his hat to her. That was all. He tipped his hat and kept walking. The next morning he passed her again and tipped his hat again. He did this every morning for 4 years. Hat briefly lifted. Walking continued. No further comment. Clara, who had an accurate understanding of human behavior, recognized what Silas Holt's daily hat tip represented in the social context of Millhaven. It represented the position of a man who had lived long enough to know the difference between what a community says about a person and what that person actually is. It represented a deliberate daily public act of respect offered without expectation of return. She never mentioned it to him. He never mentioned it to her. They understood each other completely. Through 1886 and 1887, Clara expanded. She planted 4 apple saplings and 3 pear saplings on the hillside, paying 30 cents each for trees that would take years to bear fruit, but that represented what she thought of as a statement of intention. She was not here for a season. She cultivated blackberry canes along the fence line, training them on trellises that maximized sun exposure. She established arrangements with two hill families who lived higher in the valley, trading finished dried fruit for access to their wild huckleberry patches. Her techniques refined with each season. She discovered that plums dried at a lower temperature for a longer period produced prunes of markedly superior texture to those dried quickly at higher heat. She learned that cherries dried over the supplemental hearth on rainy days, with the shed door cracked 2 inches for ventilation, retained more of their color than those dried in full sun. She developed a method for pressing dried berries into dense cakes that could be wrapped in waxed cloth and carried without crumbling, each one about the size of a large man's fist, each one containing enough concentrated nourishment to sustain a person through a full day of physical labor. She also built dug into the hillside behind the cabin a proper storage room. Cedar-lined, cool, dark, insulated against both heat and frost. The dried fruit went into cloth sacks inside sealed wooden boxes, each labeled in her careful hand the contents, the date of preparation, the weight. She kept a ledger recording every pound, processed every pound, consumed every pound remaining. By the autumn of 1888, the ledger showed a reserve of 512 pounds. The reaction in Millhaven when this number became known through the mechanism by which private facts become public property, in small towns, which is to say through absolutely no mechanism anyone could identify afterward, was confirmation of everything that had been said about Clara Whitmore's eccentricity scaled upward. Harlan Cobb shook his head in his store and said that 500 pounds of dried fruit was beyond any rational calculation of personal need and that the widow had clearly lost her grip on practical reality. Aldous Pruitt laughed until his eyes watered and told anyone who would listen that the madhouse on the hill had finally produced its masterwork. "She'll be buried in prunes before she's buried in the ground," he said, and the saloon found this very funny, and the story made its rounds. Clara heard it all. She added another 20 pounds of dried pear to her stores and entered the quantity in her ledger. It was in the last week of October 1888 that Aldous Pruitt rode up the hillside alone for the second time. He came on a Tuesday afternoon, tethering his horse at the fence line and walking up to where Clara was working at the shed door, sorting the autumn's final apple harvest. He was wearing his good coat, which meant this was not a casual visit. Pruitt was a man who understood the grammar of clothing. He stood for a moment watching her work with the expression of a man who has practiced what he intends to say and is now finding it slightly harder to say than he practiced. "Mrs. Whitmore," he began. "I'll come directly to the point." "Please," Clara said. She did not stop sorting. He wanted to buy her land. Not the shed, not the cabin separately, but the entire 5 acres the buildings included as a single transaction. He intended to expand the mill's log storage operation, and the hillside east of town was the right grade for the kind of drainage he needed. He offered her $120 for the parcel, which was 4 times what she had paid for it, and considerably more than it was worth by any conventional assessment. He expected her to say yes. The offer was generous by his own calculation, and he had made it generous deliberately, not out of charity, but out of the understanding that a generous offer declined reflects poorly on the person who declines it. A widow on a steep hillside with no obvious income and 500 pounds of dried fruit for company offered 4 times what she paid for her property by the most influential man in town. There was only one rational answer. Clara listened to the offer without changing her expression or her pace. When he finished, she looked up at him for the first time since he had begun speaking. "No, thank you, Mr. Pruitt," she said. He blinked. He had a man's face when an expectation fails the brief naked surprise before the recovery. "The offer is quite fair, Mrs. Whitmore." "I'm sure it is," she said, "but the land isn't for sale." "May I ask why not?" Clara looked at him for a moment with the particular calm of a person who has calculated things that the person asking has not thought to calculate. Then she went back to her sorting. "No," she said pleasantly, "you may not." Pruitt rode back down the hill with the stiff posture of a man declining to show that he is annoyed, which is itself a form of showing it. He told 2 people that evening that the widow had refused a generous offer and that this was the clearest proof yet of a woman who had lost her practical bearings entirely. What he did not say, because he had not thought of it, was that Clara Whitmore might have reasons for her decision that had nothing to do with a failure of practical reasoning. That she might have seen something in that hillside, in that east-facing slope, with its morning sun and consistent afternoon breeze that he, looking at the same ground, had simply been unable to see. Some people look at land and see what it is. Other people look at land and see what it could become in the hands of someone who understands what they are looking at. The last supply train of the season left Millhaven on the 15th of November, 1888. It was a Tuesday, cold and clear, the kind of day that presents itself as reasonable while concealing what it is actually preparing. The locomotive sat at the depot long enough to unload what it had brought: Cobb's quarterly order from Hargrove and Sons, the mail, 2 passengers, and a crate of goods for the church, and then it backed out of the station and turned west and disappeared into the mountain passes that separated Millhaven from the rest of the world. Clara watched it from the hillside. She had been watching the mountains for weeks. The snow line had dropped earlier than any of the previous 3 autumns. The passes, which in a normal year stayed open to rail traffic through December and sometimes into January, had already received 2 unusual early storms that had left the higher elevations looking from a distance like something that had been decided rather than merely weathered, the kind of snow that does not reconsider. She watched the train disappear and did not wave and did not speak, and stood there for a while longer in the cold afternoon with the wind coming across the hillside from the west, pulling at her shawl. Then she went into the shed and opened her ledger and wrote November 15th, 1888, final train of season, reserve £512. She closed the ledger. She stood in the shed for a moment, surrounded by the labeled boxes and the cloth sacks and the 3 years of work that lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and she breathed in the particular smell of the shed, which was the smell of summer preserved against everything that winter intended. Then she went inside and started the hearth fire and made her supper. An ember moved quietly in the stable beyond the north wall, and the mountains stood in the last of the light, the way mountains stand, which is to say without any opinion at all about what is coming. The silence came before the hunger, but the shed was full. The first missed train produced what Millhaven was best at producing: a reasonable explanation. The 3rd of December came and went without the sound of a locomotive in the valley, and the men who gathered at Cobb's store that evening constructed the absence into something manageable. The passes had been difficult. The weather had been unusual. The railroad ran on schedules made by men in warm offices who could not always account for what the mountains decided to do. It would come in a day or 2. It always came. The reasonable explanation held for a week, then 2 weeks. Then the 17th of December arrived and passed in the same silence as the 3rd, and the reasonable explanations became harder to construct and easier to see through, and what replaced them was not yet panic, but the specific unease of people who have trusted a system and are beginning to suspect without wanting to confirm the suspicion that the system has failed. Cobb's store was still stocked in the way that a store is stocked in the middle of winter, after absorbing a full autumn's worth of purchases. There was flour and coffee and salt pork and most of what 260 people needed to get through December. There was enough for 3 weeks, perhaps 4, if people were careful. The shelves were not empty. They were merely not as full as they should have been, and that difference, invisible to the eye, but felt in some other register, entirely produced the particular anxiety of people who can see a shortage coming, but cannot yet see how far away it is. Cobb took inventory twice in the last week of December. He did not share the results. He was not in this a dishonest man. He was a man who understood that certain information released without preparation produces results that are worse than the problem the information describes. He had seen it before in a mining camp outside of Spokane in 1879, where a rumor about supply shortages had produced a run on the stores that consumed in 2 days what would have lasted 2 weeks if people had remained calm. He was not going to let that happen in Millhaven. What he did instead was raise his prices. Not the dramatic overnight increase that would signal alarm, but a gradual adjustment announced, quietly attributed to supply irregularities that would certainly resolve themselves shortly. Flour went from $2 a sack to $2.50. Coffee from 30 cents a pound to 40. Salt pork up accordingly. He told himself this was rational. He told himself it was the market at work, and that the market was the most honest mechanism available for managing scarcity, and that what he was doing was simply allowing the market to function. He also, in the second week of December, moved 40 pounds of flour and 20 pounds of coffee and a quantity of salt pork into the storage room behind his living quarters on the second floor of the store building, where they were not available for sale at any price. He did not write this down. The 31st of December came in on a wind from the northwest that drove snow horizontally across the valley floor and kept everyone indoors who had any reason to stay there. The train that was scheduled that day, the one that was supposed to bring not only general supplies, but the holiday provisions that families had ordered weeks in advance, did not come. This time there were no reasonable explanations offered at Cobb's store. There was a different kind of silence. The silence of people who have been waiting for something to be untrue and have run out of ways to make it untrue. Aldous Pruitt sat in the corner of the store with two of his foremen and said nothing for a long time. His mill had been running on reduced operations since the middle of December, when the log supply from the timber claims became unreliable in the deep snow. He had men drawing wages for work that was increasingly theoretical, and he had his own private calculation of how long he could sustain that before the wages had to stop and the calculation was not comfortable. "It'll clear," one of his foremen said finally. Pruitt looked at the man with the expression of someone who has decided that optimism, however natural, is a form of inaccuracy he can no longer afford. He said nothing. He drove home through the horizontal snow and sat by the fire in his large house and looked at his wife Constance across the hearth, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, which is another thing that small communities are very good at. January arrived with the confidence of something that has no reason to be modest about its intentions. The temperature dropped to levels that split fence posts and cracked the ice on the horse troughs in the early mornings with sounds like rifle shots. The snow in the Cascade passes by the reports of the one man who had attempted the westbound trail on horseback and turned back after 2 days was not the kind of snow that a locomotive was going to push through without mechanical assistance that was not available on this side of the mountains. The trail was a memory. The passes were a wall. Cobb raised his prices again in the second week of January. Flour went to $5 a sack. Coffee to 60 cents a pound. Salt pork doubled. He announced this with a printed card in his window, attributed to extraordinary supply conditions, and he stood behind his counter with the careful composure of a man who has thought through the arguments against what he is doing and found them less persuasive than the arguments in favor. The town did not riot. The town was not the rioting kind. What the town did was what American frontier communities do when faced with adversity. They did not choose and cannot immediately escape. It organized itself into the factions of the desperate in the desperate, but functioning, and it waited and it grew thin. Meals shrank. 3 a day became 2. 2 became 1 substantial meal supplemented by whatever could be stretched. Mothers fed their children first and ate what remained, which was sometimes very little. The elderly, who in any community are the most practiced at suffering quietly, retreated into a conserved stillness that required the minimum of food and the maximum of warmth and said nothing about either. The men who worked at Pruitt's mill found their wages suspended in the third week of January when Pruitt closed the mill's operations entirely. There was no market for the lumber and no point in cutting it. He told his men this directly and without apology, which was the only thing about the situation that commanded anyone's respect. It was on a Tuesday evening in the second week of January that Harlan Cobb put on his heavy coat and his warmest hat and walked up the hillside east of town in the dark. He had thought about this for a week. He had constructed the argument carefully from multiple directions and satisfied himself that it was sound. He was not proud of the visit he was making, but pride, he had concluded, was a luxury that the situation no longer permitted. Clara heard Ember shift in the stable before she heard the knock, which was how she always received advance notice of visitors. She opened the door to find Cobb standing on her porch in the lantern light, his breath coming in clouds, his expression set in the careful neutrality of a man who has rehearsed his opening and is committing to it. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I wonder if I might speak with you." She let him in. She did not offer him coffee because she was not going to pretend this was a social call, and he did not ask for it because he understood why she wasn't offering. They sat at the small kitchen table, the lantern between them, and he stated his proposition with the directness of a man who has decided that directness is his best available strategy. He wanted to buy 400 pounds of her reserve. He was offering $150, which was a fair price by any honest calculation, and he knew it. He would distribute the fruit through his store at a price that reflected the emergency conditions of the market, which was his right as a merchant and the mechanism by which supply and demand maintain their natural relationship. The people of Millhaven would have food. He would recover his investment. Everyone would benefit. He presented this cleanly without decoration. Clara listened to all of it without expression. When he finished, the kitchen was very quiet except for the sound of the fire in the hearth, and Ember moving softly in the stable beyond the wall. "You want to buy it," Clara said, "so that you can sell it. That is how a store works, Mrs. Whitmore. And the price you sell it at will reflect the conditions of the market," Cobb said, "as prices always do." Clara looked at him across the lantern. The light made the angles of her face sharper than usual, or perhaps it was something else making them sharp. "Mr. Cobb," she said, "I intend to give it." The words sat between them. "Give it," Cobb repeated, "without charge, to whoever needs it." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something working in his face that was not quite calculation and not quite emotion, and was perhaps the collision of the two. "Mrs. Whitmore, that is—" He stopped. He started again. "That is not a sustainable—" "No," she agreed, "it isn't. It will last what it lasts, and then it will be gone, and then we'll see what happens. But while it lasts, no one in this valley is going to pay me for it." She paused. "Certainly not so that someone else can charge them for it afterward." Cobb stood. He picked up his hat from the table where he had set it. He looked at her once more with the expression of a man who has encountered a form of reasoning that his entire professional experience has not equipped him to counter. "You're making a mistake," he said. "I've been told that before," Clara said. "By you, among others." He put on his hat. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the latch, not turning around. "The store is almost empty," he said. It was not an argument. It was something more like a confession offered to the back wall of a woman's kitchen in the middle of a January night. "I know," Clara said. He went out into the dark. She watched through the window until his lantern disappeared down the hillside. Then she sat at the table for a while longer, not moving, looking at the place where he had been sitting. She thought about the $150. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything without pretending it was less than it was. It was more money than she had seen in a single sum since the logging company's envelope. It was real and it was significant, and she had thought about nothing except how to make her reserve last long enough to matter for the past 4 weeks. She thought about it for as long as it deserved, and then she stopped thinking about it and went to bed. Old Silas Holt was found on a Thursday morning in the first week of February. A boy named Thomas, 12 years old, the son of a family that lived 2 doors down from Silas's cabin, had been sent to check on the old man by his mother, who had not seen smoke from Silas's chimney the previous afternoon. Thomas knocked, received no answer, opened the unlocked door. The wood stove was out. The cord of wood beside it was full stacked neatly against the wall, enough for 2 more weeks of winter at least. The cabin was cold but not frozen, which meant the fire had been out for less than a day. Silas was in his chair by the stove, his hands folded in his lap, wearing his coat, which he had put on at some point when the cold came in. His face was very still. He looked, Thomas would say afterward, like a man who had simply decided to stop. The cabin's food supply, when the men who came to take care of things investigated, consisted of a half-empty tin of coffee and a small amount of cornmeal. That was all. The wood pile told its story plainly to anyone willing to read it. Silas had kept the fire going as long as he had food. When the food was gone, he had stopped feeding the fire. He had sat down in his chair, folded his hands, and died of hunger in a warm cabin with enough wood to have lasted until March, because the wood was the one provision he had made in abundance, and the food was the one provision he had trusted someone else to keep supplying. He had not told anyone he was out of food. He had not asked. He had been in this, as in all things, the kind of man who took care of his own needs silently and died rather than become a burden. He had tipped his hat to Clara Whitmore every morning for 4 years. That was what he had given her. That was what she had. The news reached Clara by mid-morning, brought up the hill by the older of the 2 Hill family boys, who still visited regularly. He stood in her doorway and told her what Thomas had found, and Clara stood very still while he talked, and when he was done, she thanked him and closed the door. She sat down at the kitchen table. She had not cried since the April morning in 1885 when she had closed the door on the foreman named Greer and sat down with Edmund's envelope and the knowledge of what came next. She had not permitted herself tears in the 4 years since, not from the mockery, and not from the loneliness, and not from the mornings when the wind came off the mountains, and the shed felt very large and she felt very small inside it. She cried now, not long, not with any indulgence. She allowed herself a few minutes at the kitchen table, her hands flat on the wood, and let the grief for Silas Holt move through her, the way cold moves through a building that has been left open to the winter. Then she wiped her face. She stood up. She went to the shed. She sat on the porch for 30 minutes before she could make herself move toward the stable. She had loaded the sledge with 100 pounds the night before in the early dark before she knew about Silas, out of the planning instinct that had governed her life for 4 years. The sledge sat ready in the lean-to, the cloth sacks and wooden boxes arranged with the efficiency of long practice, tied down against the slope of the hillside trail. But she sat on the porch. She thought about the morning Cobb had refused her the table in front of his store. She thought about Pruitt on horseback laughing. She thought about the women's auxiliary meeting that she had not attended but had heard about in full detail from the Hill family wife who seemed to consider Clara a reliable audience for Millhaven's social proceedings. She thought about Constance Pruitt's patient, gentle, devastating smile. She thought about what it meant to carry 100 pounds of her labor down to people who had spent 3 years performing various inventive descriptions of her sanity and set it out in front of them for nothing and stand there while they took it. She sat with that thought until she had looked at it from every direction. Then she thought about Silas Holt sitting in his chair with his coat on and his hands folded and enough wood to last till March stacked against the wall. She stood up. She did not go down for the people who had mocked her. She understood that clearly, and it was important to her to understand it clearly because she was not going to lie to herself about her own motivations at this late stage of her life. She was not going down because she had forgiven them, or because she was above anger, or because she was the kind of woman who turned the other cheek as a spiritual discipline. She was going down because Silas Holt had tipped his hat to her every morning for 4 years and had not asked for anything in return and had sat down in his chair and then died rather than ask for what he needed, and she could not add her own pride to the weight of that death. She went to the stable and brought Ember out and hitched the sledge and led the mare down the frozen track toward Millhaven. She set up in front of Cobb's store on the same ground where he had refused her a table 3 years before. She used 2 sawhorses and 3 wide planks from her wood store, covered with a canvas she used for hauling, and arranged the cloth sacks and boxes with the same systematic organization she brought to the shed itself. Each variety was clearly distinguished. The berry cakes were stacked separately. She had brought a tin pail and a ladle for demonstrating the reconstitution method, and a small hearth pot that she set over coals in an iron bucket for showing how the dried fruit could be simmered into a compote that stretched further and nourished longer than eating it dry. She was not there 10 minutes before Harlan Cobb came out of his store. He stood on the boardwalk above her, his hands in his apron, his face arranged in the expression of a man who has been preparing a position and is now delivering it. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "this is the front of my establishment." "Yes," Clara said. She was measuring portions into paper twists for the first family that had approached a woman with 2 small children, whose faces were the specific gray of people who have been eating less than they need for long enough that the deprivation has settled into their coloring. "I'll move if you want me to, but I thought you might prefer I stay close in case anyone from your store wants to come out and see what's available." Cobb looked at the woman with the 2 children. He looked at the cloth sacks and boxes arranged on the planks. He looked at the paper twist Clara was filling with dried apple rings. "This is not your property," he said. "No," Clara agreed, "it isn't." The woman with the 2 children looked at Cobb. Then she looked back at Clara and the paper twist in Clara's hand. The children's eyes had not moved from the dried fruit since they had first seen it. "How much?" the woman asked. "Nothing," Clara said. "Take what you need. Take some for next week." There was a commotion behind Cobb. 3 men had come out of the store mill, workers, large men, the kind of men whose physical presence takes up a specific amount of space and whose movement toward or away from a thing means something. One of them, a man named Garrett who had worked at Pruitt's mill for 8 years, walked down the boardwalk steps and came to stand beside the plank table. He looked at Cobb without particular aggression, just steadily, the way a large man looks at a situation he has already decided about. Then another man came down. Then a third. Cobb stood on the boardwalk above the scene that was organizing itself around Clara Whitmore's plank table, and he looked at the men standing near her, and he looked at the woman with the two children holding a paper twist of apple rings with the careful grip of someone holding something valuable, and he looked at the sacks and boxes with their neat labels. He was a merchant who had an empty store. She was a woman with 500 pounds of the only food available in the valley. And the men of the town were deciding in the way that men decide things in a crisis which side of the line they were standing on. He went back inside. He closed the door. Nobody cheered. Nobody made any comment at all. The men stayed where they were and more people came. And Clara worked steadily through the morning, measuring and explaining and demonstrating, and the plank table was where Millhaven came when it was hungry. Aldous Pruitt walked past on the far side of the street at mid-morning. He stopped and looked at the scene for a long moment. Clara saw him from the corner of her eye, but did not turn. He stood there for what might have been a full minute, and then he walked on and did not look back and went wherever he was going, which was not toward his empty mill and not toward the plank table either. He went home and he sat by his fire, and he thought about Silas Holt, who had worked his father's mill for 11 years and whose hat he had not tipped, not once, not in 11 years. She came back the next day with another 100 pounds. She came back the day after that, and the day after that, and every morning for 5 weeks she rose before the February dark had fully given way to gray-loaded ember sledge with the day's portion and drove down the frozen hillside to the plank table in front of Cobb's empty store. She kept the system organized the way she kept the shed organized by family, by need, by what each household required to last the week. She learned over those 5 weeks the specific hunger of 260 people, the way she had learned the specific qualities of each variety of fruit through careful observation, without sentimentality, with complete attention. She showed every person who came what she had. She explained how to use it. She demonstrated the reconstitution method with the tin pail and the ladle, showing how dried apple rings steeped in warm water for 30 minutes became soft and yielding, and how the water they steeped in became a sweet, nutritious liquid that a child would drink without persuasion. She showed how the berry cakes could be broken into pieces and carried in a coat pocket, how a man doing heavy work could sustain himself through a long, cold morning on 2 pieces and a handful of prunes, how the dried pear could be simmered with a small amount of cornmeal into a porridge that was both filling, and she said with the particular honesty of a woman who does not see the point of false modesty about something she is genuinely good at, remarkably good. She was right about that. The dried pear porridge became, in the 5th week of the emergency, something that people in Millhaven talked about with an intensity of feeling that they would later find difficult to explain to anyone who had not been hungry enough to understand it. It tasted, Constance Pruitt would say months afterward, with an expression that suggested she had not intended to be moved by it, but had been anyway, like something that someone's grandmother had made. It tasted like a kitchen that knew what it was doing. The children who had gone gray began to come back to color. Adults who had grown slow and listless found their strength returning in increments. The mill workers whose large bodies had suffered the shortage in direct proportion to the physical demands their work had previously made of them reported after the first week of regular dried fruit that they could think again, which was how they described it. The fog lifted. Garrett, the man who had been the first to walk down from the boardwalk, said that on the 3rd day after he began eating Clara's provisions, he had woken up before his wife for the first time in 6 weeks and had gone outside and stood in the cold February air and felt for the first time since December like himself. He told this to Clara at the plank table, standing in the cold, holding his week's portion under his arm. She nodded and said she was glad, and gave him an extra cake of dried blackberry for his daughter, who was 4 years old, and had a particular affinity for the berry cakes that Clara had noticed over several mornings of observation. He said thank you in the way that a large man says thank you when he means something more than the words. She said you're welcome in the way that a woman says you're welcome when she knows what the words are covering and respects it enough not to uncover it. In the 5th week of February, on a Wednesday evening, Clara sat on the floor of the storage room behind the cabin with her ledger open across her knees and the lantern set on the lowest shelf, and she counted what remained. 12 pounds, mostly dried pear, a small quantity of prunes, and the last of the berry cakes, 7 of them, which she had set aside deliberately for the children in the Garrett household, because she had made a private decision about that and intended to keep it. 12 pounds. She had started with 512. The difference was the winter. She sat on the cedar plank floor of the storage room for a while, with the ledger on her knees and the lantern burning quietly beside her, and she let herself feel what the number meant. Not the accomplishment of it, though the accomplishment was real. Not the vindication, though, that was real too, in ways she had not allowed herself to dwell on during the 5 weeks of daily work that had left her with the bone-deep tiredness of someone who has spent herself completely and found the spending worth it. She let herself feel the specific fear of a woman alone on a hillside in a Washington winter, with 12 pounds of food and no certainty about when the next supply would arrive. She sat with the fear. She looked at it directly the way she looked at everything, without flinching and without dramatizing. Then she stood up, marked the ledger, closed it, and blew out the lantern and went to bed. Ember moved in the stable, a single quiet shift of weight. 3 weeks later, on the 9th of March, 1889, at 20 minutes past 7 in the morning, the supply train from Portland came through the pass. Clara heard the whistle from the hillside. She was standing at the shed door when it sounded the door open behind her, the morning light coming across the eastern slope, the way it always came first and long and particular to that piece of ground. She heard the whistle carry across the valley, 3 long notes, and she stood in the doorway and listened to it the way you listen to something you have been waiting for without letting yourself wait for it, which is the only way certain kinds of waiting can be survived. The shed behind her was almost empty. 12 pounds on the storage room floor. 5 years of learning in her hands. 3 generations of knowledge in her memory. The train was coming. The mountain had remembered finally that there was a valley on the other side of it, and people in the valley who had trusted it, in a woman on a hillside who had decided long before anyone else had thought to decide anything that trust was not a plan. The train came in slowly. That was the first thing people noticed. Not the whistle, which had already done its work pulling Millhaven out of its cabins and its careful rationing and its 5 weeks of reduced expectations and into the cold March morning like a tide reversing. Not the smoke, which had been visible above the tree line for 20 minutes before the locomotive rounded the last curve into the valley. It was the speed. The train came in slowly, tentatively, the way something enters a space it is not certain it deserves to enter, and the people of Millhaven standing along the depot platform watched it come and did not cheer. Later, the cheering would be explained away, as delayed as the product of shock, as the natural response of people too cold and too depleted to summon celebration quickly. But that was not entirely accurate. The silence on the platform as the locomotive slowed to its stop was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of a community that had spent 94 days learning something about itself that it was not yet ready to say out loud. The cars were full. The porters moved with the efficient cheer of men who have no idea what they are arriving into, calling out the manifest items with the satisfaction of delivery accomplished. Flour in 50-pound sacks, coffee, salt pork, sugar, cornmeal, canned goods, fabric, medicine, hardware. The ordered goods of a civilization that had kept its promises eventually after a fashion when the mountains permitted. Harlan Cobb stood on the platform and watched his inventory being unloaded with an expression that no one who knew him from before the winter would have recognized. He had aged in a specific way during those 94 days, not in lines or in the whitening of hair, but in some structural quality of his face, as if something that had been holding it in its familiar arrangement had quietly given way. He signed the manifest forms that the porter handed him. He directed the unloading with the automatic competence of a man doing a thing his hands know how to do without requiring anything from him above the shoulders. When the last box was checked and the porter had returned to the train, Cobb stood alone beside his stacked inventory on the platform and looked at it for a long time. Then one of his stockboys touched his arm and said, "Mr. Cobb, should we start moving this to the store?" Cobb looked at the boy. "Yes," he said. "Yes, go ahead." He did not move to help. He stood on the platform and watched his goods being carried into a store that had been empty for 3 months, and he thought about a woman's kitchen table and a lantern between 2 people and a word give. The word had not left him since January. A porter appeared at his elbow with a clipboard. There were additional documents, it seemed, accounting adjustments. A letter from Hargrove and Sons in Portland, marked urgent, which the porter had been instructed to deliver personally. Cobb opened the letter on the platform standing in the March cold, while the last of the unloading continued around him. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully, put it in his coat pocket, and walked off the platform without a word to anyone. The letter from Hargrove and Sons was not a long document. It informed Harlan Cobb in the measured language of commercial correspondence that due to the extended disruption of service to the Millhaven route during the winter season of 1888 to 1889, the company had conducted a review of its regional contracts and had determined that the exclusivity arrangement with Cobb's Millhaven Mercantile was no longer commercially viable. The contract, which had governed their relationship for 9 years, would not be renewed at its expiration in June. The letter noted in a subordinate clause that was the most revealing sentence in the document that the company had been aware since November of the likelihood of extended disruption to the Millhaven route, based on reports from their logistics team regarding the condition of the railbed approaching the eastern passes. This awareness had been reflected in their internal planning, though it had not been communicated externally. They had known, since November. They had known the trains might not get through, and they had not told anyone in Millhaven because the information was internal, and the contract did not require them to share it, and because Cobb understood reading between the lines of the careful commercial language, because Hargrove and Sons had calculated that the disruption would resolve itself before the consequences became serious enough to require explanation. The contract that Cobb had protected for 9 years. The contract for which he had refused Clara Whitmore a table outside his store in 1885. The contract for which he had turned away 3 years of locally produced goods of a quality he had recognized in the moment of first tasting. The contract he had tried to leverage even in January, climbing a dark hillside to buy a widow's reserves so that he could maintain his position as the town's sole commercial provider. That contract was gone, and the company that had issued it had known since November that the winter would be what it was and had said nothing to him or to Millhaven. He walked home. He sat in the chair by his hearth, which was warm, which had always been warm, whose warmth he had never had any reason to doubt, because his own private store of flour and coffee and salt pork behind the upstairs door had ensured that whatever Millhaven went without Harlan Cobb did not go without the fuel to heat his home. He sat in that chair and felt with a precision that did not spare him any of the detail what he had done and what he had failed to do, and what the difference between those two things had cost. He sat there for 2 hours. Then he put on his coat and walked to the church and spoke to Reverend Aldgate and asked whether it would be possible to hold a community gathering that Sunday. The Sunday meeting was announced the following day. It was described as a community gathering, a coming together to give thanks and to address matters of common concern arising from the winter season just concluded. Attendance was not compelled, but in the way of small communities, where social obligation functions as a kind of gravity, everyone came. The church was packed to its back wall, cold breath visible in the air. Despite the 2 wood stoves working at capacity, the pews holding the full weight of 260 people arranged in the configurations of their ordinary lives. Families together, mill workers in their cluster, the women of the auxiliary in their accustomed rows. Clara Whitmore sat near the back as she always had when she attended services, which was not often. She had not been invited to speak. She had been told about the meeting by Vera Houghton, who had appeared at the hillside cabin 2 days after the train arrived, and stood at the door with the expression of a woman who has been rehearsing an approach and found in the moment of arrival that none of her rehearsed approaches are adequate. Vera had not said much. She had asked if she could come in, and Claire had let her in, and she had sat at the kitchen table in the same chair where Cobb had arrived in January, and she had told Claire about the Sunday meeting, and then she had said without any of the surrounding language that might have made it easier to say that she was sorry. Not for the general sorry of the winter and its deprivations, for the specific sorry of having sat at the Women's Auxiliary meeting in 1886 and raised her hand and then lowered it when Constance Pruitt looked at her. Clara had listened. She had not told Vera that it was all right because it was not entirely all right, and she respected Vera too much to say so. She had said that she was glad Vera had come and that the meeting sounded like something she should attend, and she had made tea, and they had sat together for an hour in a companionship that was new and somewhat tentative, but was both of them recognized real. Vera had named the child she had lost in December. She had not said this directly. She had mentioned her daughter's name May once in a sentence about something else briefly and quietly, and then moved on. Clara had heard it and noted it and did not pursue it because grief that is offered in passing is not grief that wants pursuit. When Vera left, Clara sat at the table for a while. May. She thought about Silas and about Edmund and about all the things that winters take that no amount of dried fruit can replace. Then she put on her coat and went to check on the shed. Harlan Cobb stood at the front of the church. He had been a comfortable public speaker before the winter. He had addressed the town on commercial matters, on civic questions, on the occasions when the role of leading merchant implied the role of civic voice. He had always done it with the measured confidence of a man who considers his authority settled. He did not look settled now. He stood at the front of the church in his good suit, which hung on him slightly differently than it had in November, and he looked at the 260 faces arranged before him, and he was quiet for long enough that people began to shift in their seats. 3 years ago, he began. A woman came to my store with a sample of dried fruit and asked for permission to sell it from a table outside my door. He stopped. He was not gathering his composure. He was deciding in real time how honest he intended to be. The room was very still. I refused her, he continued. I told her that people wanted goods from established sources. I told her that what she had was homemade and that homemade was not good enough for my establishment. He paused. What I did not tell her was why I was really refusing. The stillness in the church deepened. I refused her because I had a contract with a supply company in Portland, and the contract required me to source my goods through them, and she was local goods, and local goods threatened the contract. I refused her because the contract was worth money to me, not because her fruit was inferior. I knew the moment I tasted it that it was not inferior. He reached into his coat pocket. I received a letter from that same company on the day the train arrived. The letter informed me that they are terminating our contract. He read from the letter, not all of it, but the relevant portion, the subordinate clause about knowing since November. He read it slowly so that everyone in the room could understand what it said. They knew, he said when he had finished reading. Since November, the company whose schedule this town depended on, whose contract I protected at the cost of refusing locally produced goods, knew that the winter might cut us off and said nothing, to me or to anyone here. He folded the letter and put it back in his pocket. My store was empty for 3 months, he said. My shelves had nothing on them but the weight of what I should have done differently. The woman I refused in 1885 fed your families with food she had made with her own hands over 3 years, and she gave it without charge, and she did it after I went to her cabin in January and offered to buy her stores so that I could sell them. She refused me. She used a word I have not stopped thinking about since. He looked toward the back of the church. She said she intended to give it. The church was silent in the way that rooms are silent when a truth has been said that the room had not known it was waiting to hear. Mrs. Whitmore, Cobb said, I was wrong about your fruit. I was wrong about your judgment. I was wrong about what this town needed from its merchants, and what it needed was not what I provided. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway in front of everyone here because it seems to me that asking in private after what I did in public would be a coward's way of settling an account. He sat down. Aldous Pruitt rose next. He did not stand at the front. He stood where he was, in his pew, which was near the middle of the church, and he spoke to the room from there, which was either a form of modesty or a form of honesty about the fact that the front of a room was not where he had earned the right to stand today. He was a big man, and his voice carried without effort, which was the one thing in the room that was unchanged from before the winter. I named the shed on the hill, he said, the widow's madhouse. I said it first, and I said it loud, and I made sure it stuck because that's what I do. When I decide something is worth laughing at, I laugh at it in a way that other people feel permitted to laugh too. He stopped. I was wrong about the shed, and I was wrong to do it the way I did it, which wasn't just having an opinion, but making sure everyone in this town felt like they had to share it. He put his hands on the pew in front of him. His knuckles were large, work-hardened, the hands of a man who had built a business with them, even if he had also built other things with them that were less admirable. Old Silas Holt worked my father's mill for 11 years, he said. He worked for me for 4 after that. He was never late, never complained, never asked for anything he hadn't earned. He looked at his hands. 2 weeks before Thomas found him, I knew he was running short. One of my men mentioned it, said the old man's larder was looking thin. I said it wasn't my business. I said Silas was a grown man who would ask for help if he needed it. He was quiet for a moment. A man's hunger is always someone's business. I know that now. I should have known it then. I did know it then, and I chose not to know it, and that is the most damning kind of not knowing there is. He sat down. The church received his words the same way it had received Cobb's. Constance Pruitt stood. She had not discussed this with her husband beforehand. He knew this because she stood without looking at him first, which was not her custom. She stood and smoothed her dress and looked at the congregation with the composure of a woman who has been composing herself for this specific moment for several weeks. "There is a young woman in this room," she said, "named Vera Houghton." Vera, 3 rows behind, and to the left, went very still. In 1886, at a meeting of the Women's Auxiliary, Mrs. Houghton raised her hand and said she wanted to learn to dry fruit from Mrs. Whitmore. I discouraged her from pursuing it. I told her it would reflect poorly on her husband's position at the mill. Constance paused. I did not tell her that I was afraid. I was afraid that if Mrs. Whitmore's methods worked, it would reflect on the rest of us for not having thought of them ourselves. And so I dressed my fear in the language of social propriety, which is the thing women in my position do when we want to stop something without admitting why we want to stop it. She turned slightly so that she was addressing Vera directly. I sent you away from her door, she said. Whatever the winter cost you, whatever you lost in those months, I carry part of that. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am asking you to know that I know what I did. Vera Houghton did not say anything. She looked at Constance Pruitt for a long moment, and then she nodded once, a slow and deliberate movement that was not forgiveness and was not refusal, but was something more complicated than either, which is what honesty between women often produces when the wound between them is real. Constance sat down. Others spoke. The mill workers and the mothers and the families who had stood at the plank table in the February cold. They spoke briefly, most of them because the thing they wanted to say was not complicated. She had been there when nothing else was. They said it in the various ways that people who are not practiced at public expression say the things they mean most, which is to say imperfectly and genuinely, and the imperfection was part of the meaning. The room waited. Clara Whitmore stood. She was not a tall woman. She had never been a tall woman, but something in the quality of her stillness as she rose from her pew near the back of the church, the straightness of her back, the unhurried pace of her movement, the way she seemed to have no interest in arriving at the front of the room more quickly than she chose to arrive, made the room orient toward her with the attention that is reserved for people who have demonstrated not claim the right to be listened to. She stood at the front of the church and looked at the congregation. All of them, Cobb in his pew with his careful composure, Pruitt with his large hands, Constance with her straightened back, Vera 3 rows back watching. My mother's name was Abigail, Clara said. She learned to dry fruit from her mother, whose name was Rourke, who learned it in the hill country of Kentucky from women who had preserved food through winters that made this one look like a mild inconvenience. The knowledge is not mine. I am the latest in a line of women who understood one thing, that summer does not last, and that what you do with summer while it is here determines what you survive when it is gone. She looked around the room. I did not build my shed to prove anything. I built it because waste offends me. Every autumn, the fruit trees in this valley drop thousands of pounds of food onto the ground, and it rots, and the worms and the weather have it, and this community trusts a railroad schedule printed in Portland by men who have never spent a winter east of the Cascades. She paused. You have heard Mr. Cobb read what the company knew in November and chose not to share. I want you to sit with that for a moment, not in anger, in information. The people who printed that schedule made a calculation, and in their calculation, Millhaven was a line item, not a community. And we built our survival on that schedule as if it were a promise from someone who knew our names. The room was completely silent. I am not angry with any of you, she said. Not Cobb, not Pruitt, not the women who called the shed unwholesome. She said this without sentiment, as a statement of fact that she had arrived at through examination rather than through the kind of generous feeling that does not survive contact with real events. Mockery is what people produce when they encounter something they do not have a framework for. You did not have a framework for what I was doing. You do now. She looked at Vera Houghton. The knowledge is simple, she said. The work is not easy, but it is learnable and it is available to anyone willing to do it. The fruit is here. The sun is here. The technique is 3 generations old, and it works, and I know every part of it, and I will teach anyone who asks." She looked around the church again. "Bo family in this valley needs to go through another winter like this one. Not because the trains will always run. They won't. Not because the companies will tell you when there's a problem. They won't. But because there is enough growing on these hillsides every summer to carry every one of you through every winter, this territory can produce if you are willing to work in the summer and think past the end of the season." She looked at the congregation for a moment longer. "I am not here to be right," she said. "I am here to teach. The fruit doesn't care who laughed." She walked back to her pew and sat down. The church was quiet for a long time. Then Reverend Allgate said something closing and appropriate, and people began to move, and the quality of the movement was different from how people move when a meeting has merely ended. It was the movement of people who have somewhere to go next that matters. Vera Houghton was waiting on the church steps when Clara came out. She did not say what she had been intending to say. She had been intending to say several things composed over the previous several days, and standing on the church steps in the March cold with Clara coming through the door, she found that none of them were right. What she said instead was, "Will you show me from the beginning?" Clara looked at her. "Yes," she said. They walked out into the March morning together, not talking, in the companionship of a decision made. The summer of 1889 came early and warm, which felt like an apology from a climate that does not apologize. The wild plums bloomed in the creek bottoms in May, and the huckleberries came on strong in July, and the abandoned orchards east of town produced a crop of extraordinary abundance, as if the trees had spent the winter accumulating in tension. The valley was as it had always been, full of food that needed only the knowledge and the work to become provision. Clara began teaching in June. She started with Vera Houghton, who had the natural aptitude of a person who has been waiting to learn something for 3 years and has not let the waiting spoil the readiness. Vera learned quickly and precisely, with the attention of someone for whom the knowledge is not academic. She learned to read fruit for its ripeness. She learned to slice for thickness. She learned the salt bath and the honey wash, and the difference between drying and cooking, and why that difference is the whole of the matter. She learned to read the sky for drying weather, and the hearth for supplemental heat, and the cheesecloth frames for the subtle signs of moisture still present that indicate another day's work is needed. She was an excellent student. By August, Clara had 11 students, and by the end of August, construction had begun on 11 new drying sheds on the hillsides around Millhaven. Each one built to Clara's specification, each one oriented east for the morning sun, each one fitted with the sliding cheesecloth frames that allowed efficient loading and the circulation that does the real work. Clara visited each site, inspected each construction, offered correction and approval with the same even practicality she applied to everything. Aldous Pruitt built a shed on the south-facing slope behind his house and asked Clara, directly arriving at her cabin on a Tuesday morning and standing at the door with his hat in his hand, if she would come and look at it. She came and looked at it and told him the ventilation spacing was wrong and showed him how to fix it. He fixed it without comment. She showed him the temperature management for the stone hearth he'd installed. He listened with the focused attention of a man who has decided that listening carefully is the one useful thing he can contribute. "You're a quick student," Clara told him on her second visit to his shed. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. "I'm trying to be," he said. Constance Pruitt became over that autumn one of Clara's most devoted students. This was not something either of them had predicted. They did not become friends exactly in the way that friendship is usually understood. But they developed something that was in some ways more durable, a working relationship built on a shared competence that had been reached from different directions and met in the same place. Constance had the organizational intelligence of a woman who had run a household and a social network for 30 years. Applied to the drying operation, this translated into systems record keeping, labeling, storage rotation that Clara recognized as genuinely good. "Your pear is excellent," Clara told her in October, examining a sample from Constance's first full harvest with the seriousness she brought to all assessments of technical quality. Constance received the evaluation with a composure that did not entirely conceal that it meant something to her. They sat on Clara's porch that afternoon, slicing the last of the season's apples, working in the unhurried rhythm of a task that rewards the slow and punishes the rushed. The valley below them was going gold with turning leaves. The 11 new sheds visible on their various hillsides at various distances stood in the afternoon light. They did not talk much. There was a great deal that could have been said between them and was not said, and both of them understood that this was not avoidance but economy, the decision of two practical women not to spend time on words that the work had already covered. The apples went onto the frames, the afternoon moved through its light. Below them, Millhaven arranged itself for winter with a different knowledge than it had carried into the previous one. Harlan Cobb reopened his store in March with the new supply from the train and kept it open without interruption through the spring and summer. In September, he installed a new section along the east wall. He built the shelving himself, which he had not done since his early years in the business. And he did it carefully with the attention of a man who has decided that the things he builds with his hands should reflect what he actually believes rather than what he has merely calculated. The shelves held dried fruit from 12 producers in the Millhaven Valley. Each item was labeled with the producer's name, the variety, and the date of preparation. Above the section, he hung a painted board, the letters hand-lettered by his own adequate but earnest hand, Millhaven's own. He charged a fair price for each item. He paid each producer a fair price in return. When he calculated his margins at the end of September, they were smaller than they had been under the Hargrove & Sons contract. He noted this in his ledger and found that it troubled him considerably less than he had expected. He sent a letter to Hargrove & Sons acknowledging the termination of the contract and wishing them well in their future commercial endeavors. He did not mention the letter they had sent him on the day of the train's arrival, the one that revealed what they had known in November. He had considered mentioning it. He had decided that the response he wanted to make to that revelation was not in a letter to Portland, but in the wall of locally sourced goods on the east side of his store, which said everything he intended to say about the difference between a supply chain and a community. He stopped at Clara's hillside one afternoon in October, riding up the track that he had climbed once before in the dark of a January night. She was working at the shed door when he arrived, the same posture she had had when he'd knocked on her cabin door. In the winter, the same self-contained efficiency of movement. He dismounted and stood at the fence. "The dried pear section is selling well," he said. "I can't keep it stocked." "I'll have more in November," Clara said. "The Hill families are producing well this year." He nodded. There was a moment of quiet. "It's the most honest business I've ever done," he said. He said it to the fence post rather than to her, which was either a form of modesty or the natural destination for a man saying something out loud for the first time. Clara looked at him. "Good," she said. He rode back down the hill. She watched him go briefly, then went back to work. Clara Whitmore lived on the hillside east of Millhaven for 27 more years. She dried fruit every autumn until her hands could no longer hold the knife with precision, and when that day came, she directed the work from a chair in the shed doorway, while Vera Houghton and the women who had learned from Vera carried it forward with the competence of people who have fully received a skill and made it their own. She kept her ledger until the last autumn of her life, recording in the careful hand that had never lost its exactness, the pounds processed and the pounds stored and the pounds distributed, because the record was the evidence, and the evidence mattered, and waste to the end offended her. She passed in the spring of 1916 at the age of 75 on a morning in April, when the apple saplings she had planted on the hillside in 1886 were in full bloom, and the valley below was the specific green of a Pacific Northwest spring that has forgotten nothing the winter taught it. Ember had preceded her by 11 years and was buried near the drying shed where she had waited so many patient mornings while her mistress loaded the sledge. Clara's grave was in the Millhaven Cemetery beside Edmund, who had asked her to forgive a tree and had trusted her to manage what came after. She had managed it. Vera Houghton's daughter, born the year the train stopped running and named Abigail at her mother's insistence, grew up spending September mornings in the shed that Clara had built, learning the work from her mother the way Clara had learned it from Abigail, which was the way the knowledge had always moved from hands to hands, from season to season, from the understanding of one generation to the preparation of the next. The phrase that passed into common use in Millhaven in the years after the winter was filling the shed. It meant what it meant in the most direct sense, and it also meant something larger, the discipline of preparation during abundance, the refusal to trust the continuation of good conditions as a substitute for provision against bad ones, the practice of doing in summer what winter will make impossible. It was spoken with the quiet authority of people who had learned something through an experience that left no room for abstract disagreement. Cobb's store carried Millhaven's own for 30 years. When Cobb retired in 1907, the new proprietor kept the section and kept the painted board because by then it was not a commercial decision, but a statement of identity. This was what Millhaven did. This was what Millhaven was. The drying shed still stands on the east-facing hillside above what is now a small agricultural community that remembers its history with the particular pride of a place that survived something and learned from it. The cedar shakes have been replaced 3 times over the decades. The cheesecloth frames have been rebuilt twice. The stone hearth at the north end is the original because some things built correctly in the beginning do not need to be remade. Above the door in letters carved by a hand more practiced at knowing fruit than at cutting wood is an inscription that Clara placed there in 1890, the year after the winter, the year after the church and the shed, and the 11 new operations spreading across the valley's hillsides. Summer forgets. The shed remembers. It is a short sentence. It contains the whole of what 3 generations of women in Clara Whitmore's line had understood about the relationship between abundance and survival, between the ease of good seasons and the demands of hard ones, between what a community feels it needs to do when life is comfortable and what it discovers it must have done when life is not. Every September, when the fruit comes ripe in the valley, the shed opens. The frames come out, the work begins. The knowledge moves from the hands that have it to the hands that are learning it, which is the only reliable form of preservation that exists. Clara Whitmore did not save Millhaven because she was exceptional. She saved it because she was prepared, which is a different thing entirely and a more useful one. Exceptional is something a person is born with or is not. Prepared is something a person chooses deliberately in the long, ordinary days before the emergency arrives, when there is still time, when the sun is still up, when the fruit is still on the tree. She had chosen it in a kitchen in the Willamette Valley with an envelope on the table and a map in her hands, in the knowledge of 3 generations alive in her memory. She had chosen it on a hillside with $30 in a sorrel mare, and the absolute conviction that the valley's wasted abundance was not waste at all, but provision waiting for someone willing to make it. She had chosen it every morning for 30 years, rising in the dark to do the work that people who do not understand preparation call unnecessary, right up until the day it became the only thing standing between a community and the full consequences of its own comfortable assumptions. That is the thing about preparation. It looks like paranoia until it looks like salvation. And the distance between those 2 descriptions is exactly the length of a winter that nobody planned for in a valley where one woman had. Summer forgets. The shed remembers.